She was 8 years old when she started correcting her teachers. Not about math or spelling, or the kind of things children usually argue about life, about death, about why people suffer, and what happens when we leave our bodies, and whether the soul ever really stops learning. Her third-grade teacher sent a note home saying she was concerned that maybe the child needed counseling, that it was unnormal for someone so young to talk about existence like she'd lived it 1,000 times before. And her mother, reading that note at the kitchen table, felt a chill run down her spine because she'd been thinking the same thing for years, but had wanted to admit it. Her daughter didn't talk like a child. She talked like someone ancient wearing a small body. And when they finally took her to Dr. Patricia for regression therapy at age 26, when they asked her to go back to her first lifetime, she didn't go back to ancient Egypt or medieval Europe or any recognizable human civilization. She went somewhere else entirely. And what she said made Dr. Patricia put down her pen and just listen, because this wasn't a story about living. It was a story about teaching. I wasn't born yet. I was between, and I was showing others the way. The office was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. A steady rhythm that seemed to pull Maya deeper into the hypnotic state than Dr. Patricia's voice alone could manage. Maya sat perfectly still in the leather chair, her breathing slow, and even her face relaxed in a way it never was during her waking hours when she carried the weight of knowing things she shouldn't know, feeling things she had no reason to feel. Understanding patterns in human behavior that most people spent lifetimes learning, and she'd somehow always just known. Dr. Patricia had seen many people claim to be old souls, had heard hundreds of regression subjects describe multiple past lives as if they were reading from a script they'd memorized, but something about Maya was different from the moment she'd walked through the door. There was a quietness to her, not shyness, exactly, more like the calm of someone who had seen enough drama to no longer be moved by it, who had witnessed enough human suffering and joy to understand that both are temporary and neither defines the eternal nature of what we really are. When Dr. Patricia asked Maya to describe where she was, Maya's voice came out different than it had been during the intake interview, softer somehow, as if she was speaking from very far away or from very deep inside. I'm in a space that doesn't have walls. It's not a room exactly, more like a dimension. There's light everywhere, but it's not coming from any source I can point to. It's just there, ambient, like the light is part of the fabric of this place. And there are others here with me, not bodies, consciousness, awareness, souls between incarnations. They're confused, scared. Some of them just died and they don't understand where they are. They're looking for loved ones who died before them, looking for answers about why their lives went the way they did, looking for someone to help them make sense of what just happened. Dr. Patricia felt the hair on her arms stand up. She'd conducted hundreds of regressions, had heard people describe the space between lives before, but never like this. Never from the perspective of someone who worked there, who served there, who had a role in that liminal space where souls go to rest and review and prepare for what comes next. She asked Maya what she did in that place, what her function was, and Maya's answer came without hesitation, as if she was simply reporting facts about a job she'd held for so long it had become second nature. I guide them. I help them remember. They come here and they're still thinking like humans, still identifying with the body they just left, still believing the story of that lifetime is the only story they have, and my job is to help them expand, to remember they're more than that one life, to understand that what felt like failure might have been exactly what their soul needed, that the pain they experienced wasn't punishment but curriculum, that they're not broken or damaged or less than, they're exactly where they need to be in their evolution. The way Maya described it made it sound both simple and profound. This work of helping souls transition from human consciousness to soul consciousness, from the limited perspective of one lifetime to the vast awareness of their eternal nature. She talked about how some souls arrived angry, demanding to know why their lives had been so hard, why they'd suffered, why God or the universe or whoever was in charge had allowed terrible things to happen to them. And her job wasn't to give them answers exactly, because the answers were inside them, in the life review they would experience, in the understanding they would gain when they saw their lives from a higher perspective. Her job was to hold space, to be patient, to radiate the kind of calm knowing that reminded them they were safe, that they were home, that everything that happened in that human life had purpose, even if the purpose wasn't clear yet. Dr. Patricia asked if Maya had always done this work, if this was her role in every lifetime, and that's when the first major revelation started to unfold like a flower opening to reveal layers inside layers inside layers. No, Maya said, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been sadness or nostalgia, or both. I used to incarnate, used to have bodies, used to live human lives. I did that for a long time, hundreds of lifetimes, maybe thousands. I learned every lesson there was to learn, experienced every kind of relationship, every kind of death, every kind of love, every kind of loss. I was rich and poor, male and female, healthy and sick, powerful and powerless. I did it all, and then something shifted. I graduated, not to some higher realm or dimension, just graduated from the need to keep incarnating, and I was given a choice, to stay in that space between lives and rest, or to serve, to help others who were still in the cycle, still learning, still struggling, still trying to figure out why they kept coming back. The weight of what Maya was describing began to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. She was talking about being a guide, a teacher, a helper in the realm between lives, the space that most humans never consciously remember, the place where souls review their lifetimes and plan their next ones and heal from the trauma of death and the difficulties of physical existence. Dr. Patricia had read about such beings in spiritual texts, in accounts from other regression therapists, in the work of researchers who had spent decades documenting what people reported seeing in deep hypnotic states, but she'd never spoken directly to someone who claimed to be one of them, who described that role not as something special or elevated but as simply the next stage of her own evolution, the natural progression from student to teacher that happens in every school, every tradition, every system of learning. Maya described the souls she worked with in detail that made them feel utterly real and heartbreakingly human, even in their discarnate state. There was the man who died in a car accident at 32, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children, who arrived in that between space absolutely destroyed by the fact that he wouldn't get to see his kids grow up, wouldn't get to grow old with his wife, wouldn't get to finish the life he'd just started building. Maya had sat with him, if sitting is even the right word for what consciousnesses do when they don't have botness, and helped him see that his death wasn't random, or cruel, or meaningless, that his soul had chosen a short life this time because it didn't need long, that his children had chosen him as their father, knowing he would leave early because that experience of loss would teach them something essential about impermanence and resilience and the difference between loving someone and needing them, that his wife would grieve but also grow stronger, that nothing was wasted, nothing was wrong, everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to. There was the woman who died at 97 after spending the last decade of her life in a nursing home with dementia, who arrived confused and disoriented, not understanding where she was or what was happening, her consciousness still fragmented the way it had been at the end of her human life. Maya describes spending what felt like weeks, though time doesn't work the same in that space, helping this woman's soul reintegrate, helping the pieces come back together, helping her remember who she was before the dementia, before the old age, before that entire lifetime, and watching the moment when the woman's awareness suddenly expanded and she remembered not just that one life but all of them, remembered her true nature as an eternal being having temporary experiences, remembered that the confusion and loss of self she experienced at the end was not failure but completion. The soul's way of detaching from a body, it was ready to leave. There was the young girl who died at 7 from cancer, whose soul arrived, not sad or angry or confused, but curious, excited, even like a student who'd finished an exam early and was eager to see how she'd done. Maya said this child's soul was relatively young, only 15 or 20 incarnations, but old enough to understand the basic rules of the game, old enough to know that physical death wasn't an ending but a transition. The child wanted to know if she'd learned what she'd come to learn, if her short life had served its purpose, if her parents would be okay. And Maya had helped her see that her life, though brief, had been complete, that her parents had volunteered for the heartbreak of losing a child because they needed that experience to break open their hearts in a way nothing else could, that the grief they would carry would transform them, make them more compassionate, more present, more aware of what really matters, that her death was a gift even though it would never feel like one to them. The pattern Maya described was the same across hundreds of souls she'd worked with. They arrived believing their lives had been too hard or too short or too painful, believing something had gone wrong, believing they'd failed or been failed by the universe, and her job was to help them see the bigger picture, not to minimize their suffering, or tell them it didn't matter, or convince them it was all worth it, but to help them understand that suffering is part of the curriculum, not a sign that something broke, that hard lives often teach more than easy ones, that the souls who suffer most deeply often signed up for that difficulty because they were strong enough to handle it, and because they needed that specific kind of pain to break through some layer of their own consciousness that would uncrack any other way. Dr. Patricia asked Maya how she knew what to say to each soul, how she knew what they needed to hear, and Maya's answer revealed something that would become central to understanding her current lifetime. I don't know, not consciously. It's more like I feel it. I can sense where they're stuck, where they're still holding on to the story of that lifetime, where they're resisting the bigger truth. And I just reflect it back to them, mirror it, hold up a perspective they can't see from where they are. I'm not giving them information they don't have. Everything they need to know is already inside them. I'm just helping them remember, helping them access it. Like a midwife, the baby is already there, already complete. My job is just to help it be born. That metaphor landed in the room with weight. Maya as a midwife of consciousness. Maya helping souls give birth to their own understanding. Maya witnessing the moment when confusion transforms into clarity, when grief transforms into acceptance, when the limited perspective of one lifetime expands into the vast awareness of the eternal. And Dr. Patricia realized that this was why Maya had always been the way she was, even as a child, why she'd corrected her teachers, why she'd talked about existence like someone who'd seen it from both sides, why she'd never quite fit in with people her own age. She wasn't just remembering past lives. She was remembering between lives, remembering her role as a guide, and that knowing had leaked through into this incarnation, even though she wasn't supposed to remember, even though the whole point of incarnating is to forget so you can experience life fresh without the weight of all that other knowing. Dr. Patricia Krisha asked the question that was forming in both their minds. Maya, if you were a guide between lives, if you had graduated from the need to incarnate, why are you here? Why are you in a body again? Why did you come back? The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled with something that felt like grief or regret, or maybe just the weight of a decision made long ago that was only now being fully understood. Maya's face, which had been peaceful throughout most of the regression, tightened. Her breathing changed, became shallower, faster, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that hadn't been there before. Because I made a mistake. I thought I could help more from there than from here. I thought guiding souls between lives was enough, but I watched them go back, watched them incarnate again and again, watched them struggle with the same patterns, the same fears, the same blocks, and I realized something. I realized that knowing the truth intellectually doesn't change you the way experiencing it does. I could tell them 1,000 times that suffering serves a purpose, that pain is curriculum, that nothing is wasted. But until they feel that truth in their bones, until they live it, until they make choices from that understanding, while in a body with all its limitations and fears and desires, the knowing doesn't stick. It's like reading about swimming versus getting in the water. You can know all the mechanics. You can understand the theory. But until you're in the water, until you feel it, until you have to trust it to hold you, you don't really know. So she chose to come back, chose to incarnate one more time, even though she didn't have to, even though she'd completed her own cycle of learning. Even though she could have stayed in that between space forever, helping souls transition, and never again experiencing the density and difficulty and limitation of physical existence. She came back because she wanted to remember what it felt like, wanted to understand the struggle from the inside again, wanted to be a teacher not from some higher dimension where everything is clear and obvious, but from right here in the mess, in the confusion, in the middle of a human life with all its uncertainty and pain and beauty and complexity. But here's what she didn't anticipate, what no one could have told her, because you can't really know it until you experience it. She didn't anticipate how hard it would be to remember. Didn't anticipate the weight of carrying soul-level knowing in a human consciousness that was undesigned to hold it. Didn't anticipate the loneliness of being 8 years old and trying to explain to adults that death is unending and suffering is unrandom, and we all just consciousness having temporary experiences, and having them look at her like she was damaged or delusional or in need of intervention. She didn't anticipate spending her childhood feeling completely alien, completely alienated, completely isolated, unable to connect with people her own age because she could unpretend not to know what she knew. could unfake enthusiasm for things that felt trivial compared to the eternal questions that occupied her mind constantly. Dr. Patricia watched tears stream down Maya's face, watched her body shake with sobs that seemed to come from someplace deeper than this one lifetime, and understood that this was the core wound, the thing Maya had come to heal. The gap between what she knew and what she could communicate. The isolation of being a teacher with no students who were ready to learn from her. The frustration of seeing people suffer in ways that could be eased if they just understood what she understood, but having no way to transmit that understanding. Because humans learn through experience, not explanation. And no amount of knowing can substitute for the hard-won wisdom that comes from actually living through something. Maya described her childhood through the lens of this understanding, and it painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful. She talked about being 5 years old and comforting her grandfather as he was dying, telling him it was okay to let go, that he'd be met on the other side by people he loved, that his body was just a vehicle, and he was about to remember what he really was. She talked about the shocked look on her parents' faces, the whispered conversations about whether a 5-year-old should be saying things like that, whether they should take her to a psychologist, whether there was something wrong with her. She talked about learning to hide it, to stop talking about the things she knew, to pretend to be normal, even though pretending felt like slowly suffocating under layers of acceptable lies. She talked about school being torture, not because the academic work was hard, but because it felt pointless. Learning multiplication tables when she carried knowledge of how consciousness creates reality. Learning state capitals when she remembered guiding souls through the geography of the afterlife. Learning to raise her hand and wait to be called on when she spent timeless eterna, helping consciousnesses navigate questions that mattered, infinitely more than anything being taught in a third-grade classroom. She talked about the note her teacher sent home, the one that said she needed counseling, and how that note had made her feel like there was something fundamentally wrong with her, like the knowing she carried was a disease that needed to be cured rather than a gift that needed the right context to be understood and valued. She talked about her teenage years, about watching her peers obsess over dating and social status and what college they'd get into, and feeling like she was watching children play while a war raged nearby that they were too young or too sheltered to perceive. Not that their concerns weren't real to them, not that those things didn't matter in the context of a human life, but she couldn't help seeing the bigger picture, couldn't help knowing that in 50 years or 100 years or after their next death and rebirth, none of those concerns would matter at all. That they'd look back on their teenage anxieties the way adults look back on childhood fears of monsters under the bed, true in the moment, overwhelming even, but ultimately inconsequential in the scope of an eternal soul's development. She talked about trying to be a teacher in this life, thinking maybe that would scratch the itch, would give her a way to serve that felt aligned with what she remembered doing between lives. She got a degree in education, got hired at an elementary school, lasted 2 years before burning out completely. Because teaching children to read and write and do math felt nothing like teaching souls to understand their eternal nature. Because the curriculum was fixed and the standards were rigid, and the whole system was designed to produce compliant citizens who could pass tests and follow rules, not conscious beings who understood the nature of existence and their place in it. She kept wanting to go off script, to talk to her students about why we rehear and what we relearning, and how to navigate difficulty with grace. And she kept getting reprimanded for being inappropriate, for confusing the children, for bringing spiritual concepts into a secular classroom. So she quit, spent years drifting, trying different jobs, different relationships, different cities, searching for the thing that would make sense of why she'd come back, what she was supposed to do with all this knowing that felt increasingly like a burden rather than a gift. And that's what brought her to Dr. Patricia's office at 26 years old. Not because she wanted to know about past lives. She already knew she'd had hundreds of them, but because she was desperate to understand this life, this current incarnation that felt so hard and so isolating and so utterly misaligned with what she knew she was capable of. And now, under hypnosis, the answer was revealing itself. She'd come back to learn what she couldn't learn as a guide, to experience the limitation and frustration and isolation of being a teacher with truths no one wanted to hear, to understand viscerally, not just intellectually, what it feels like to know something important and have no one believe you, to carry light in a world that often prefers darkness because darkness feels safer, more familiar, less demanding. She'd come back to be humbled, to remember that knowing isn't the same as embodying, that understanding the theory of consciousness doesn't mean you've mastered the practice of being human, that you can guide 1,000 souls through their post-death transitions and still struggle with how to navigate a regular Tuesday afternoon in a body that gets tired and hungry and lonely. Dr. Patricia asked Maya what she understood now that she was seeing this pattern, and Maya's answer carried the weight of genuine realization. The kind that doesn't come from someone telling you something but from seeing it yourself and knowing it in your bones. I understand why it's so hard. Why I've felt so lonely and isolated and wrong my whole life. Because I'm trying to do something that's almost impossible. I'm trying to be a soul-level guide in a human-level world. I'm trying to teach truths that most people aren't ready to hear, and aren't be ready to hear until they die and do their life review and remember what they really are. I came back thinking I could bridge that gap, thinking I could help people wake up while they're still alive, still in bodies, still in the middle of their learning. And maybe that's still possible, but not the way I thought. Not by telling them what I know, but by living it. By being an example of someone who carries that knowing and still shows up for the mundane, difficult, beautiful mess of being human. The emotional climax was building now. That moment where something fundamental shifts and a person moves from understanding something intellectually to feeling it transform their entire being. Maya's breathing deepened, her face relaxed. The tears that had been flowing steadily slowed and then stopped, replaced by something that looked like peace or acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion, after carrying a weight for so long, and finally being able to set it down. Dr. Patricia asked her what was happening, what she was feeling, and Maya's voice came out clear and strong in a way it had been through the entire session. I'm forgiving myself for thinking I could fix this, for thinking I was supposed to have all the answers just because I remember things other people do, for being frustrated with people who don't understand what I understand, for feeling superior sometimes, or isolated other times, or just endlessly exhausted by the gap between what I know and what I can communicate. I'm forgiving the part of me that thought coming back was a mistake, because it wasn't. It was exactly what I needed. I needed to remember what it's like to be powerless, to have wisdom that feels useless, to be a teacher with no students, because that's what most of the souls I used to guide felt like in their lives. Powerless. Like they knew things or felt things or understood things that the world around them didn't validate. And I couldn't really help them process that until I'd lived it myself, until I'd felt it in my own body, my own life. She talked about the souls she'd guided, who had been mystics or healers or spiritual teachers in their human lives, who had struggled with the same isolation and frustration she was experiencing now, who had died feeling like they'd failed because they couldn't get through to people, couldn't make them understand, could untranslate eternal truths into language that humans lost in the density of physical existence could grasp and integrate. And she realized that she'd helped those souls see that their struggles weren't failures, but successes, weren't signs they'd done something wrong, but proof they'd done something brave. They'd tried to be bridges between worlds. They'd tried to hold space for truths that most people aren't ready to receive. And that trying, that willingness to be misunderstood and isolated and labeled crazy or weird or inappropriate, that was the teaching. That was the gift they gave. And now Maya was doing the same thing, being a bridge, holding truths that felt too big for the world she lived in, struggling with how to be both soul and human, both eternal and temporary, both teacher and student. And maybe that struggle was the point. Maybe she didn't need to resolve it or fix it or make it comfortable. Maybe she just needed to live it fully, to let herself be both things at once, to accept that she would always feel somewhat alien in a human world because she remembered what most humans forgot, but that didn't mean she was broken or wrong or that she made a mistake in coming back. It meant she was doing exactly what she'd signed up for, learning what can only be learned through the specific, unique, challenging experience of being a very old soul in a very young body in a very confused world. When Maya opened her eyes, the first thing she did was laugh. Not bitter laughter or cynical laughter, but genuine surprised delight. The kind that comes when you've been taking something too seriously and suddenly see the cosmic joke of it all. Dr. Patricia asked what was funny, and Maya shook her head, still smiling. I've been so angry, at the world for not understanding, at people for being asleep, at myself for not being able to wake them up. And now I see that I was doing the same thing I used to watch newly arrived souls do, coming in with an agenda, expecting reality to match my expectations, resisting what is because it doesn't match what I think should be. I was being a terrible student while trying to be a great teacher. And that's hilarious. That's perfect. That's exactly the kind of irony the universe loves. She talked about how different she felt in her body now, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a backpack full of rocks and had just realized she could take it off. The pressure to be some kind of spiritual teacher, to somehow transmit all this knowing she carried, to fix or save or wake up the people around her, all of that released, replaced by something simpler. The understanding that she could just be herself, could share what she knew when people asked, could live according to her own understanding without needing others to validate it, could be a guide in small, quiet ways, through presence rather than teaching, through example rather than explanation, through being someone who had seen both sides and still chose to show up fully for this side. Dr. Patricia asked what she was going to do differently now, and Maya's answer was both profound and beautifully ordinary. I'm going to stop trying so hard, stop pushing, stop being frustrated when people don't get it. I'm going to live my life, do work that feels meaningful, build relationships with people who feel like soul family even if they don't remember what I remember. Be present for the small moments, the Tuesday afternoons, the ordinary conversations, the simple pleasures of being in a body on a beautiful planet that's doing its best to teach us through joy and pain and everything in between. And if people want to know why I seem different or how I know the things I know, I'll tell them, but I won't make it my mission anymore. My mission is just to be here, fully, completely, with all my knowing and all my not knowing, with all my remembering and all my forgetting. She left Dr. Patricia's office that day and went home, and for the first time in 26 years felt like maybe she belonged here after all, not because the world had changed or because she'd figured out how to translate eternal truths into acceptable human language, but because she'd accepted the gap, the space between what she knew and what she could communicate, the loneliness that comes with remembering what most people forgot, the frustration of being a bridge between worlds when most people are comfortable staying on one side. She'd accepted all of it as part of why she came, as curriculum rather than punishment, as exactly the experience her soul needed to have even if her human self didn't enjoy it. Over the following months, something interesting happened. Without trying, without forcing, without making it her mission, Maya started attracting people who were ready to hear what she had to say. They showed up in coffee shops and grocery store lines and online forums, drawn to something in her energy, something in the way she moved through the world with calm, knowing that everything is unfolding exactly as it should. They asked her questions. How do you stay so peaceful when the world is such a mess? How do you deal with loss? How do you know what you're supposed to do with your life? And she answered honestly, from her own experience, without trying to teach or convince or convert anyone to her way of seeing, just sharing what she knew because they asked, being a guide the way she'd been a guide between lives, holding space, reflecting back, helping people remember what they already knew deep down but needed someone to mirror back to them before they could access it. She started a small practice, doing exactly what she'd done in that between space, helping people process grief, helping them understand that the hard things in their lives were signs that something had gone wrong, but were often exactly what their souls needed to break through to the next level of consciousness. She didn't call it soul guidance or spiritual teaching or anything that sounded too woo or too precious. She called it counseling, called it coaching, used acceptable mainstream language for work that was ancient and eternal and utterly essential. And people came, not in floods, not in the dramatic way she'd imagined when she was younger and thought she was supposed to wake up the masses, but one by one, soul by soul, person by person, who was ready to hear what she had to share. And she realized that this was enough, more than enough, that she didn't need to be some famous spiritual teacher with a huge following to fulfill her purpose. She just needed to be available, to be clear, to be a safe space for people who were ready to remember what they'd forgotten, to do in this world what she'd done in that between space, to be a midwife of consciousness, helping people give birth to their own understanding, watching the moment when confusion transforms into clarity, when suffering transforms into wisdom, when the limited perspective of human existence expands just enough to let in light from the eternal. Sometimes the souls who remember most clearly are the loneliest. They walk through a world that feels too small, too dense, too focused on things that don't matter in the scope of eternity. They try to connect but can't quite manage it because they're operating from a different frequency, carrying knowledge that most people aren't ready to integrate, seeing patterns that most people aren't ready to recognize, and they often spend years feeling broken or wrong or like they made a mistake in coming here. But they didn't make a mistake. They volunteered. came back one more time, even though they didn't have to, because they wanted to help from the inside instead of watching from outside, wanted to be bridges between worlds, wanted to remember what it's like to struggle so they could guide others through that struggle with genuine empathy rather than abstract understanding. If you've always felt like you don't belong here, if you've carried knowing that no one around you seems to share, if you've easily spent your life trying to help people wake up and frustrated by how hard it is to get through, maybe you're like Maya. Maybe you're an old soul doing new work. A guide who came back for one more round. A teacher whose greatest teaching is simply showing up fully human while carrying eternal awareness. You're not broken. You're not wrong. You're exactly where you need to be, learning exactly what you need to learn, serving exactly who you're meant to serve. The loneliness will ease when you stop trying to fix it and start accepting it as part of the curriculum. And the right people will find you when you stop searching and start simply being who you are. There are others, more souls who remember, more teachers learning to be students, more bridges between worlds. The next one starts now.